Hello, I am Anna Maria Parry and I am visiting Missouri Star Quilts, and I thought it was the perfect opportunity to tell you all about my newest book, Blueprint Quilting. I thought I would go through some of the inspirations in writing the book, show you all the details of the projects, and also some maybe less typical things that I've included in my book for you, like a trip through art school, just in case you ever wanted to go. So first and foremost, I thought I should say that this is not my first book, but it is my first book exclusively on patchwork. I have written general sewing books, I've written books for baby and kids sewing, and I've even written an embroidery book, but this is the first dedicated book to quilt making. And I think I was sort of waiting until I felt like in my career, after 20 years of designing fabrics and making quilts, I felt like I had finally developed my own personal perspective on quilt making and my own sweet and happy place with how I approach quilt making. And I also realized that in my teaching, my approach was not necessarily a typical one. And so when I finally cracked the code on my own style of making for myself, I thought it was worth sharing. And that's why I wrote Blueprint Quilting. So I am going to walk you through the book. We're going to have a little preview together. So I named it Blueprint Quilting because of my tendency to lean on my background in art school and development of composition and design. And so when I use the term blueprint, I'm really talking about that overall structure. Most of us use the term blueprints for architectural or home building or buildings, but that's how I think of these quilts that we're making. I think of quilts as opportunities not just to use the same pattern and change up which fabrics you use in the same pattern, but I think of quilts as opportunities to redesign the whole space. Maybe what used to be a small section of patchwork becomes applique. Maybe what was really pale color becomes really intense color. So I created Blueprint Quilting as a way for you to take these sort of recipes, but then make them your own, all the while feeling comfortable in these structures that I've sort of taught to you. So you are actually going to come to art school with me because that's where my personal path took me. In fact, everything that I needed to learn about quilt making, I actually learned in art school. I just didn't know I was learning it to become a quilter one day. So in art school, we're going to talk about color and composition. You can see here that in the book, I've got this gorgeous color wheel of fabrics laid out. And in fact, what I have in front of me here today is one of my favorite teaching tools when I'm teaching quilt making classes, because color and how I use color is very often the #1 question that quilters ask me. How do you decide to use those colors? How do you blend all those different fabrics together? I never would have put those two things together, but they look so good when you do it. So certainly some of it is personality and a little bit of bravery, which I have in spades, but also I want to share color with you in a way that hopefully maybe makes you feel more confident in choosing things that you love on the shelf, but not sure how to put them into your quilts. So this color wheel that I've designed kind of shows you that even very multicolored fabrics can still sit in a color category. Now, why is all this important? Certain things happen when you combine certain colors together. And in my book, I go through different formulas that really teach you the science of the color wheel, which is important, but it's not a rule. I think more than anything, what these scientific sort of presentations of the spectrum offer us is opportunity to decide, like, oh, I really like what happens when these colors come together, or what can I expect when I pair these colors together. So I talk about different combinations, from analogous, where colors are sitting right next to each other, or complements when they're sitting opposite each other, which creates a lot of visual tension. But I also talk about, beyond color, we talk about value. We're really talking about the principles of art, any kind of art. I learned it in painting and drawing school, but I'm bringing it over and sharing it with you in our quilt making. So throughout the book, in the art school chapter, when I talk about value, which is how light a thing is or how dark a thing is, I share a quilt that's in the book to show you what I mean by value. When I talk about line, which is another principle of art, I share a quilt with you that really emphasizes line. The same is true with shape, form, space, texture. These are all the major principles of art. Now, beyond color, I also share principles of composition. And when I talk about composition, I am talking about where things are placed on a quilt space or a canvas or a weaving. Composition is nothing more than the way that you've laid out elements next to each other. In our world, it's a way that we've laid blocks next to each other, okay? So we talk about balance, we talk about symmetry, radial symmetry, which you can see behind me because it's not just the same right to left, but it's the same top to bottom, right to left. It goes around all four corners. We talk about balance through asymmetry, right? And we talk about focus, movement, repetition, and how important, and I think this one is so important for me, especially as a quilter, is to have variety, but also harmony and unity. That's something that I'm always striving for in my quilts. Obviously, I'm not afraid of bold colors and lots of different prints or a maximalist style to quilt making, but that doesn't mean that I'm not looking for opportunities to unify all those elements and make them harmonious and very pleasing to look at. So there's scale and proportion, there's contrast, and so that's kind of like your crash course in art school as applied to quilt making. The second out of 3 sections of the book is called Patchwork School. Now, some of you maybe have been in patchwork school much longer than me. I've been patchworking for about 20 of my 52 years, and but it took me a long time before I realized that even though I wasn't taught to do this as a child or I didn't have any quilt makers in my family, I did have a lot of creativity in my family on the embroidery side, the painting side, homemaking, dressmaking, all these different things, but I was never taught quilt making. And so my approach to making blocks is a purely self-taught one. I was fortunate that there were a lot of resources in my life by the time I approached it in my mid-30s, that there were a lot of places to learn quilt making. But sometimes my methods aren't exactly like maybe how you've been taught. But as we all know, in our world, there are so many ways to do just one thing, aren't there? So what I do in the Patchwork School chapter is I go through like the materials that I like to use, an overview of fabric, some considerations for your fabric choices. This is especially a good chapter for people that are new to quilt making. The book is really written from the standpoint that no matter where you are, hopefully some part of this book meets you exactly there and picks up and inspires you. So I go through my favorite types of threads and materials, things to consider depending on the final use of your quilt. Is the quilt just going to hang on the wall, or is it going to be given to a baby? That means it's going to need to be washed like 10 times a day. So there's all sorts of considerations when we're making quilts. I go through my favorite tools and notions. I talk a little tiny bit about sewing machines and adhesives. And then finally, we get to the building blocks portion of Patchwork School. Now, building blocks is exactly that. These are just block tutorials. They're my favorites that I use over and over again. You probably already know how to do them. Some of them might be new to you, but I've given you 10, 12, I don't remember exactly how many, but a handful of blocks, some traditional and some maybe not so traditional, a couple that I've made up. But every single block that I teach you, we're going to use it later in the project section of the book once we get to the actual blueprints. So it's a pretty nice primer. But so basically what I'm giving you is your building blocks so that you can go build out these blueprints. And the kind of exciting thing is that once we get to the blueprint chapters and I've sort of built these structures for you, if there's a grandmother's fan here and you decide you'd rather use a log cabin, you can think of these blocks as interchangeable elements in your quilts. So again, really I'm focusing on structure, which we can dive into a little bit more. Oh, and I also have a big section on applique, and I teach you all my favorite methods for applique, whether it's by machine or whether we're doing it by hand. I have like 3 different methods of doing it by hand, and maybe you'll find one that you really click with. So when we get to the blueprints is when I get to share all the juicy details of making the quilts. So there are actually 4 blueprint sections, and each of the blueprints focuses on a certain type of composition, okay? So when I talk about composition, I talk about like the overall structure and layout of a quilt. So the first blueprint is one that I call Grand Central. You might call it a medallion quilt, because when I talk about a Grand Central quilt, I'm talking about something that has a central focus and it has some sort of subordinate details that float around it. So it's also sort of a symmetrical quilt on all sides. And something else that the book does, apart from having quilt projects for you, there's 12 quilt projects, but there's also in each blueprint, I give you a completely like non-quilt project that kind of uses the same ideas in terms of what the layout looks like, but maybe it's an EPP window panel, or maybe it's this beautiful tote bag, but it uses the same elements of design in that specific blueprint. And the other thing that I want to mention about each of the blueprint chapters is that I have created 3 quilts in each blueprint section. One that's beginner, and there's no applique, and it's very straightforward patchwork. The second one is intermediate, and it has patchwork, but I usually introduce a little bit of applique. And the third quilt is what I would consider like more advanced. I don't want to say it's harder. I don't want to say that it's a higher skill level. I will say that it's a bigger commitment of your time. And I'll also say that you and that quilt will be better friends by the end of the process, because you will have spent a lot more time together than the more beginner style quilt. So what I brought with me today to show you is some of these more elaborate quilts, because I think they're so nice to see the details of them. So in the Grand Central chapter, I have the spontaneity quilt for you. And I'll flip over to that in the book. So the first one is the Do-Si-Do, which is a very basic patchwork, but kind of a unique color arrangement of starting with one color group in the center and moving in rings of different color groups as you go out to the edges. And then the hedgerow quilt does something similar, but in a completely different fashion, with log cabins and some Dresdens as well to create a scalloped edge. And then finally, the spontaneity quilt was named that because when I was designing the whole quilt and using these grandmother fan blocks, I had originally had all the scalloped edges that the 2 grandmothers fan creates turned the same way, but when I was putting it on the wall, this one little scallop was turned the wrong way, and I thought actually that sort of looks like a fan flower, and I think I'll leave it that way. So that's how it got its name, the spontaneity quilt. But you can see it still has that very central focus, and I just want to show you a few of those details now. Friends, meet the spontaneity quilt. Spontaneity quilt, meet my friends. So this is a nice close-up view of how I used blocks that come together to create an overall design. So this might look like I've created this big patchwork wheel. I haven't. What I've done is I've created 3 grandmother's fan blocks that are exactly the same, just turned different ways around the corner. So this whole thing is actually based on a 9-inch block. This is one of them. And then these are 4.5. So the blocks come together in a way that's a bit deceiving to the eye simply because of how I've used color. So that's, again, a little bit of code cracking on how I design quilts. So this isn't, again, an appliqued wheel. It's grandmother's fan blocks that I've turned certain ways. And this is that little rogue fan flower that just turned the other way and decided to become a flower. So because that turned the other way, I decided it needs a vine and some leaves, and that sort of, I knew that I was going to be doing some applique on the outer borders, but after starting with a much more basic patchwork in the center of 16 patches, I decided that I would get a little bit more elaborate on the edges. And so that sort of flower that happened really inspired the applique style of vines on the outer edges. And in fact, I even think it inspired the really cute sort of vine design for the backing. So it's so important to take your time with your quilts and not to be in a rush, because I think that there's a lot of creativity that's in there on the inside of you, but it's hard to listen to if you're just quickly trying to get things done. So that is the sort of preeminent project in the Grand Central section. I also have this fun EPP curtain panel that I mentioned. So the second blueprint is what I call Triptych. And when I use the word triptych, I'm using it almost in the same sense that we do in art history. A triptych is a 3-piece whole piece of artwork. So in other words, like old paintings, like Renaissance paintings and triptychs would actually be 3 separate panels. Usually the center panel is the most in-focused one, and the side ones are a little bit more subordinate. And all these blueprints came out of me sort of looking at the quilts that I've made and what I continue to go back to. I so often have made quilt patterns like my Safe Passage or my Plot Twist or my Visions quilt. So many quilts that I've made actually have these 3 vertical columns, and it took me a while to realize that I kept going back to certain blueprints, but that's why I've included them in the book, because I have found them to be pretty foolproof. So the first one is a quilt that I made for my son Roman. So I named the quilt Roman numerals after him because it takes on this sort of like blocky and almost like Roman numeral style lines and edges. But again, you have this center panel that's different and 2 side panels that are the same. But again, that's the more beginner one, and it's very basic patchwork. You can see the graphic of it there, sort of really helps you see what you're putting together. You're just putting together quarter log cabins and whole log cabins with some clever placement of color. And then the fence line quilt is also a triptych kind of design, but I've really achieved the difference by how blue and how dark the edges are compared to a lightning and more orange center. And then finally, the Terrace Blooms quilt, or I'm sorry, the Terrace Views quilt. You can very evidently see that the whole quilt has a long center and then 2 subordinate sides that are matching. And I brought that quilt with me as well to show you some of those details. I was married 2 years ago, almost exactly, in Greece on the island of Idra. And this quilt was inspired by the views on the terrace. That's why it's called Terrace Views, because as you look out over the island, you see all these arched doorways, you see these beautiful pink and purple bougainvilleas growing everywhere. And this quilt, believe it or not, just 9-inch blocks, whole thing, okay? So this is a 9-inch grandmother's fan again. This is just a 9-inch half square triangle. And just the way that I've put them together and put a center circle on it makes it appear as though it's this sort of, it almost looks like a snow cone to me. But these arching vines over it, the vines that kind of fall over the patchwork panels is what makes everything feel a lot more complicated than it is. But the whole base of the quilt is 9-inch blocks. I even have some snowballs all through the center. The whole center of the quilt is just snowball blocks. It's just that I haven't necessarily put the corners on all the snowballs. So you can see I put it on this one, and this one, so they would join together and make diamonds. So I'm really looking at what we call in the quilt world at secondary design. The first design is the block, what's happening in the block. But the secondary design is the thing that happens when we put the blocks together. So I focus on those elements a lot to decide what colors to choose, so I can highlight some of those things. And then I let the patchwork do as much as it can for me. And if I want to come back and embellish further, that's when I might place some applique over the top of a section of blocks. So in essence, this is almost a panel quilt where I've taken 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 blocks, put them together in one panel, and then that's what I'm performing the applique on. Okay, so then the whole thing, when it comes together, there's a lot of repetition that's happening, but it's not boring repetition because I'm using lots of different fabrics from lots of different sources and styles, and I'm making it unified. Remember how I said it's important to me to keep things unified as well as interesting and diverse, but this is unified because of its color. Is it unified to put this print with a little print that's got Alice in Wonderland in it? Maybe not when you look at it sitting on the shelf, but I'm just looking at it for color. I don't care too much about the print, which is funny coming from a print designer, but I'm really looking at these quilts for color and interest, or rather I'm looking at materials of what it can do for me in terms of the design. So also this project, which I call the Sawtooth Tote, was inspired by the Triptych blueprint. And you can see that it's got this central panel of just a more illustrative fabric, but it's got these side panels that are more plain and these fun little dividing lines made out of these sawtooth half square triangle straps. So this is one of the examples of the non-quilt project in the book that I really like. The next blueprint chapter is what I call Kiss on the Lips. So this is a big X, which is why I named it Kiss on the Lips. And these quilts explore, sometimes very subtly and sometimes more obviously, what it looks like to create the whole quilt space in the shape of an X. So you can see in the kaleidoscope quilt, which is just a simple pairing of snowballs and shoe fly blocks, but with really clever color arrangement, you can see just this subtle X that appears across the center of the quilt, highlighted by the red and the yellow blocks. And then the next one is the Basket of Flowers quilt. So this one was a really unique quilt for me to make because I kept the colors very sort of more specific. I really wanted to use just mostly the yellow and purple complement pair, and yellow and purple sometimes together, the very true versions of those colors, is very jarring. So I like the combination, or the challenge rather, of creating a sort of yellow and purple color story, but making it very like kind of soothing and old-fashioned almost. And so I chose fabrics that were very floral, like the outer edges of those fabrics is this huge peony flower on a pale lavender background. But that big print is actually sort of matched in interest and size by the Dresdens in the center. And so in one way I'm getting the big flowers through print, and another way I'm getting the big flowers by using Dresden sort of like flowers. But I named this one Basket of Flowers because those gold and kind of rusty yellows around the center reminded me of a woven basket in those 16 patches. And then finally, the more preeminent quilt in this chapter is called the Open Borders quilt. And this, I think you can really see that X format come through. And this is one of those quilts where it reminds me to share with everyone that if you are a maximalist quilter like me, if you really like bringing every single color to the table and you want to use it all, you want to use dark, light, printed, solid, plaid, old-fashioned, contemporary, and put it all in one quilt, the most important guest that you also need to invite to that table is value, and that is organizing your quilt space by how light or how dark a thing is. So while you might see a lot happening in this quilt, it's actually highly organized, and I've used exact same fabrics in exact same positions all the way around. And so again, it's creating a unity, and it gives your eyes sort of a place to rest. I mean, this is something that was hammered into my head as a painting student. You have to sort of have an entry point for the viewer and an opportunity for the viewer's eye to move all around the painting space, or quilt space in our case, and a place for them to kind of gently leave. And so that bright center sort of brings your eye in, but it carries you around through the more medium and sort of more seductive curves, and it sort of lets you move around the quilt, and then finally you have these sort of more dark edges. This is another one where it's really important to talk about scale. I have some very large scale solid block areas, but out on the edges I have some really tiny things. I have this quilt with me as well, and I'd love to show you the details. So this one was a true labor of love. You can see that I have actually hand quilted this whole thing. I've hand appliqued it. This one section here can kind of show you how I start with these big background blocks. Again, this whole entire quilt is based on 12-inch blocks, the whole thing. They're set on point, but they're put together in a way that, again, repeats itself around all four corners. That's a radial symmetry. It's not just symmetry. It's like, so once you've designed a quarter of this quilt, you've designed the whole thing, because then you just have to go repeat it 3 more times. But you can see that my scale changes a lot. We have these whole blocks here and a whole block here, but then I divide the blocks smaller. I have these sort of medium applique pieces, but when we get out to the edges, I have these really teeny tiny patchwork. That's pretty small patchwork for me. It's not the smallest in the world, but for me, that's pretty small patchwork. But I have these, they're basically like 36 blocks, 36 patch blocks. But that difference in scale is really important to make things sort of balanced in an interesting way and not be too obvious. So this was all hand appliqued, hand quilted, and it's probably my favorite quilt that I've ever made. It's a very special quilt to me. This quilt was made mostly from fabrics that I collected all over Australia when I was traveling and teaching there in 2018. So it's a very special quilt to me because I kind of just saved all those fabrics in one bin. I didn't know they were going to go together. I had just collected them from all the different stores that I was teaching at during my time there. And then once we were sort of shut off from the world during the pandemic, I thought, well, it's going to be a long time till I travel. I think I'm going to pull those fabrics out and start working with them. And so that's what I did. And so it's personally very special to me. But also, you know, this is one of those quilts that I felt like was impossible to ever replicate, or it would be impossible to ever teach this quilt because I can't tell you the fabric collection of all of it. Some of it's my fabric, a lot of it's collected, some of it's vintage. But of course, anytime I say something is too hard to do, I immediately am inspired to do it. And guess what I did? So behind me today, I actually have a remade version of this quilt. This original one is the one that's on the cover of the book. But I'm very proud to say that with my new division of fabrics, Anna Maria Textiles, that I was actually able to really source just the first 5 collections of Anna Maria Textiles and find something just as beautiful and diverse. And in fact, you know, being a quilter that really likes creating things from various sources is so much of what inspires me on how I make my collections, that while they go together in the sense that I quilt them together, they don't necessarily match exactly perfectly all the time. Like my style is one that I want to try and give you history, even if you bought it all at the same time on the shelf together. I want to try and give you something that feels like it came from lots of different places and feels very collected. So I was very proud. I felt like I had done my job as a designer when I could pull from just the first 5 collections and really emulate the original quilt with these collections together. But I took all the same cues. I looked to this original one for all the colors and even like placing yarn dyed plaids in the background. I placed our plaids in garden variety in the same position. So I'm very excited that that exists in the world and that it's replicatable, if that's a word. So the final blueprint chapter is one that I call color study. And it's a bit more free form. I call it color study because it really allows you to take the concept of the spectrum and even a value and just sort of make something more free form or more intuitive. In other words, you can start in a place and then let it continue on to somewhere altogether different depending on who's making the quilt. So the first one is called dip dyed, where I just take kind of like 2 color categories and merge them together just by splitting the half square triangle between a solid and a small scale print. So the solids kind of experience their own change from top to bottom, and the prints experience a completely different change from top to bottom in terms of their color and value. And it was almost such a fun color experiment quilt that I didn't even quite know exactly what was going to happen, but I created a plan and just stuck to it, even if it got a little weird in some places, right? So that's kind of that's a great thing to do with scraps. And then I also did a quilt called Time Travel. I am not someone that uses grays or neutral tones very much. I'm starting to experiment more with it, but I have collected some neutral fabrics that I really love, some sort of charcoals and some khakis, and I decided it was time to do something with them. So I set those neutral fabrics in the background, but organized them by value. You can see that I started very light and moved to very dark. But then I put these sort of ropes, these twisting ropes of color on top of them. So while the big background blocks experience a change from light to dark at the bottom, the value of the colors sitting on top do exactly the opposite. They start dark at the top and go to light at the bottom. So the contrast along the bottom stays really high and the contrast along the top stays really high. Again, just like a really wonderful kind of experimentation with some fabrics that you have, and especially fabrics like maybe you don't like them. Maybe you're wondering, why did I even buy these fabrics? They all have a place if you are doing something interesting with how you lay out and experiment with them. I had actually cut a bunch of strips of bias thinking I would do a biased edge binding, and it just ended up in this quilt. And then finally, the last project in these quilts is called Conversations with Georgia, and it's about a quilt that I made completely improvisationally, all based on one of my favorite paintings by Georgia O'Keeffe. And so that was kind of a fun and interesting place to start any sort of quilt or artistic process, is to look at someone that you love and admire. And it wasn't a piece of artwork that I was trying to replicate in any way, but I was looking at it for its lines and its curves and its colors, and the process was just a really fun and exciting one, and a very big learning experience for me. So that is Blueprint Quilting. I am just thrilled when I get the opportunity to talk about this book. A few close friends that I've endorsed this book to, I said, I hope you love this book because I'm never writing another one. Because there's just a lot of love and intent and excitement poured into this book. And I hope that it empowers you to try some things that you've never tried before, or it just validates being as individual as you want to be with your quilt making. And if it's important to you, it should be important to people around you, no matter how you want to make your quilt. So I'm happy to help. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you've enjoyed the presentation of Blueprint Quilting. And if you want to learn more about me or the other things that I've designed and written, you can visit annamariaparry.com. And don't forget to seize the fabrics that you love, take them to art school, take them to patchwork school, and then join me for quilt making.